The playback and the PowerPoint slide deck will be posted to the eChannel Pop-Up PD website. I will paste that link in the chat. And last thing before we kick off and get started, there will be an automatic survey through Zoom that will pop up at the end of the webinar. If you have to leave early, you can leave early and it will still automatically open the webinar for you to please complete. Otherwise, when we end the webinar at 3:30, it will automatically pop up. It should only take a minute or two for you to fill it out, and we always appreciate the feedback. So with that being said, I will turn it over to you, Barb and Robin, to kick us off.
All right, thank you, Stacy. It's 2:02. I think that we can go ahead and get started. Just check in with our interpreters. Rebecca and Kim, are you set to go?
Yep, all set.
Okay. Rebecca, I'm not able to see you. I mean,
that's okay. We're going to pop on and off when it's our turn. So we won't both on the screen at the same time.
No, but I can't see. I can only see R for Rebecca. I don't see Rebecca.
Right. She's off until it'll be her turn.
And,
then
and you're going first.
Yeah,
you're going
I'll go
okay,
first.
Great.
Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure that we're good. All right. Just a couple more people are joining, but we will get started, and I'd like to welcome you all today to this EOIS-CaMS tips, tricks, and best practices webinar today. It will be recorded, as Stacy was just saying, and so you'll be able to access the recording afterward if you would like to do so. And it will be closed captioned. Just repeating those announcements that Stacy offered a couple of minutes ago, since there's still a few people just logging in. Stacy's put a question in the chat. Can someone in the chat confirm that you see both Barb and Kim's webcams, as well as the PowerPoint slide deck? Okay, so Tiffany/Randy says, yep, lots of yeses there. Great, thank you. Just before we begin, I do want to welcome our two American Sign Language interpreters today, Kim Banks and Rebecca Stuckless. If you do require ASL interpretation to ask a question, then feel free to either raise your hand or, even better, just type into the chat that you would like one of the interpreters to ask your question. Tiffany is a slash. Okay. All right. Okay, I think we're caught up then. Okay. So very first thing, just before we begin today and before we introduce ourselves, I would just like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on a virtual platform, but we'd like to take a minute to recognize, respect, and acknowledge the importance of the lands that we occupy here in Canada and from which we benefit. So today, let's reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improve relationships between nations and improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. And also, let's remind ourselves that wherever we are, here in Ontario and Canada, we do live on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and our First Nations people. What you can see on the screen now is just a little summary of what we're going to cover today. But before we get into the content, I will just introduce myself. My name is Barb Glass. I know many of you. It's great to see a lot of familiar names in the chat today and in the participants list. Also, lots of new people. That's wonderful too. We did do this webinar. Robin and I delivered it in March to the northern literacy programs. So we just wanted to point out at the beginning, if you did attend the Northern Region session back in, I think it was, this particular one was late February or early March. It will be the same webinar. It's just we've tweaked it a little bit, made a couple of updates, but the content of it is the same as what we delivered in the winter to the Northern networks. Just telling you that in case you logged in today, perhaps expecting something a bit different, but it actually is the same, is that same webinar. So I started to introduce myself and then of course got sidetracked. I will just briefly say, I'm the executive director of the College Sector Committee for Adult Upgrading. That's the College Sector LBS Support Organization. And I also am a service provider because our organization delivers one of the LBS e-channel programs called ACE Distance. So I work both in the support organization world and in the service delivery world for LBS. And I'm just going to ask my colleague Robin to introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Barb. Hi, everybody. My name's Robin Ritchie, and I am the Executive Director of Lauback Literacy Ontario, which is a provincial support organization. I also manage a school board program, and believe it or not, as manager, I do all the data entry in our program. So I am lucky, or maybe not so lucky, in that I have a foot in both worlds as well, as a support organization, but also as a service delivery organization.
Great, thank you, Robin. The last thing I just wanted to mention before we actually get into the content, just in case something goes amiss, that I'm not in my normal office area today. I'm in someone else's house and hopefully I can just still have all the technical issues or no technical issues, but if so, I know my colleagues here will be able to pick things up. You'll notice that Robin and I will speak slowly, a little more slowly perhaps than usual, just because we do want to make sure our American Sign Language interpreters have a chance to listen and interpret for the benefit of our deaf participants today. So getting right into this, we are assuming you're here today because you would like to learn a little bit more about the EOIS-CaMS system. Maybe you're quite an expert and you're just here to, solidify some of your knowledge, to see if there's any other tips out there that you're not aware of. So we do, I think, have quite a mix of people on today, which is great. If you are very familiar with CaMS and you have something to add to our tips and tricks and best practices, feel free to put that in the chat, because we can always use more information. If you have questions, you're welcome to also put them in the chat. And between us, Robin and I will monitor that throughout the presentation. Of course, at the end, if you would like to ask anything, that's fine too. So numbers 1 and 2 on our agenda today, just a little bit of background information about CaMS and some of the resources that are available for all of us who work in CaMS. Then after numbers 1 and 2, I will switch over to letting Robin present, and she's going to talk a little bit about the actual service plan items number 3, 4, and 5 on the list. And as Robin said, she works in CaMS every day, so she's got a really good handle on what goes on. I have worked a lot in CaMS, just not quite as recently, so I know Robin will be really able to zone in on some good pieces of information in numbers 3, 4, and 5. And then we'll switch back for the end and I'll finish up, and then we will wrap up. Stacy's just noted in the chat the link where the playback and the slide deck will be available for you next week, if you're interested in either looking at it again or sharing it with someone else in your organization. So number one, let's just talk a little bit about where EOIS came from and why. EOIS stands for the Employment Ontario Information System. You may know, especially if you have worked in other Employment Ontario programs, that the EOIS system is used not just by us as LBS providers, it's used by employment services, it's used by our apprenticeship colleagues, it's used for special projects that the ministry funds. So it's way bigger than just us in LBS. Within EOIS, you may also know that there are different pieces or applications within the big EOIS framework. The first one on the list, of course, EOIS-CaMS, is the one that we use for our learners and our programs in LBS. There's also a reporting site. Some of you may have access to that. And there's also SP Connect, which is the business and finance documents that the ministry uses. So even if you don't have access to SP Connect, certainly your program manager would have access to that. Whether or not you have access to the reports will depend on what your assigned role and level of permission is within the CAMS system. So the person at your organization who's responsible for setting up the CAMS licenses and users also sets up your level of access. And that person actually has an acronym name called a SPRA. And SPRA, S-P-R-A, stands for Service, Provider, Registration, Authority. Sounds like a big title, but it's really just the person, as I said, who manages the users of CAMS in your organization. We access EOIS applications, including CAMS, through what's called the BPS Secure Government System. BPS stands for Broader Public Service. So it isn't, again, it's not just us as LBS providers that log in this way. There are many, many different government organizations who have databases and various different things through BPS Secure. You may or may not be aware that a couple of years ago now, in 2022, we published a user guide, and it is available at the link that you see on the screen right now. So if you want to access it later, you can. I will just quickly type the link into the chat. So oops, I made a spelling mistake. Shouldn't try to do too many things at once. There. cscau.com/resources. So this guide was a cooperative effort between the CSC, the organization I work with, the Mid-North Network in Sudbury, and La COFA, our Francophone support organization. We'll use this guide to help us walk through some of the content today, but it is accessible for you to use. What you will notice, though, is in the initial few pages, it describes the old login system that we used to have called One Key. And now, as I just said, it's changed to the BPS Secure system. Everything else in the guide, though, is still pretty much up to date. If you are working in a Francophone organization, or you just would like to access some resources in French, La COFA has also produced some guides for EOIS-CaMS en français. And coalition.ca is their website. Again, if you are interested in accessing any of those resources in French, you can do so there. We'll just spend a few minutes talking about the My EOIS portal. That's something the government of Ontario created, I'm going to say maybe 3 years ago now. And it has been helpful in some ways in obtaining training materials and resources, and certainly announcements that are posted there. I'm sure you've all seen them when CaMS is having an outage or having an issue. So when you have an account to access the CaMS system, you also have an account to access My EOIS. Number of different features. We'll just take a quick look at them before we get into our actual CaMS pieces. Anika's asking, do I have a link to that? Oh, and Dominique put La Coalition's information in there. Thank you, Dominique. And again, if you do look at the webinar later, you can use the links directly as well. But thank you, Dominique, for putting that in there. So briefly, just a couple of features that you will find in My EOIS. The first one is that might be of use as desk aids. These are just exactly what they sound like. They're short, usually 8.5 by 11 pages if you print them out, that you can use to help with portions of different tasks within EOIS. So for example, there's a desk aid for creating a service plan, which is partly what we'll be talking about today. There is the news link, there's the FAQ link. The forums link, which is about halfway down the list on the left of the slide, is actually kind of like a chat or discussion center. And in my organization, when we have a question about the functioning of CaMS on any given day, we often pop a question into the chat in the forums link, because the ministry does monitor that the help desk for the CaMS system does monitor that forum. And so sometimes it's a way to get a quick answer, or to find out if, am I the only one that's having this issue today, or is it a more system-wide issue? And so that's sometimes helpful if they haven't yet posted a notice saying there's an issue. Then you will see a link for training down near the bottom. The ministry has created a few training videos, but most of them are not for LBS. So that's not the most useful place on the site for us. And finally, near the bottom, you'll see the user guides link. And there are some good resources in there, depending on what you're looking for. There's user guides for doing different functions in CaMS, like creating and maintaining a service plan, a number of different user guides that are there, and they are categorized usually by program, but sometimes they're categorized by topic. So what I will say is I don't find the way the resources and the user guides are indexed on the site to be super intuitive. I feel like sometimes I have to look around a bit for what I need to find. Just a quick couple of other examples of desk aids that we mentioned a few minutes ago. One at the top left, create and activate a service plan desk aid. There's another one below it on the left. And I just took a little snapshot of the top of each of these desk aids. Modifying plan items, desk aid. There is, of course, also on the top right, another desk aid related to the type of plan items. And then another one that I just took a sample of here was the address change cascade. So as you can see, they are just short, as I said, usually one page documents that you can print out and keep on your desk or save them and just open them up on your screen to do a number of different tasks in CAMS. Sometimes really helpful if you're new, or it's helpful if you are, have been away from CAMS for a little while and you're coming back to start doing it again. I mentioned the training videos a few minutes ago. This is one you may want to look at, a general EOIS-CaMS training video that's found under the training link. And you can also see it does have a transcript with it if you look on the top right of that screenshot. It's 14 minutes long, so it's not an in-depth video, but it is an introduction. If you have a new person who signs, who gets hired at your organization, that might be something to direct them to as a very quick intro to CAMS. As well as, of course, you can direct them to resources like the one that we're doing today. And then finally, again, just a quick snapshot of what a couple of the user guides look like, or the links to the user guides. Service Plan Management Chapter 08A and 08B. Notice, though, that there's two service plan links here. The top one is for employment services. That's what the ES is at the end. So you always want to make sure if you're looking at a guide that you're looking for the LBS specific one. There's a few guides that are generic no matter what program you might be working under, but always watch for that LBS indicator if you're looking up a guide. These guides are very detailed step-by-step instructions about how to do different things. And one of the people that I work with said they're good at explaining how to do something, but they don't explain why you are doing something in CAMS. So they give you the buttons to click and how to save and how to complete that little function or update, but they don't tell you any of the why behind the reasoning for doing that on the service plan or on any other piece of CAMS. The why comes from your other training like this, perhaps, and from within your own organization in terms of why you do things a certain way. Another set of resources that you might find helpful, again, particularly if you're a little bit newer to LBS or to CAMS, are some previous pop-up PD webinars that Robin and I have done. In the link below, and you can see the echannel.ca/practitioners, etc. link. The resources there are organized by fiscal year. So what I've taken a screenshot of here is just the 23-24 set of resources. And there were a couple that we did last year and also in 21-22, particularly related to CAMS reports. So on there is one for report 60B and 60D, another for report 61, and another one for report 64. If you're not familiar with the reports, that's not something we're going to delve into today. But there are reports available from CAMS to help you manage your data and also to help your staff and managers to monitor the performance measures that the ministry holds us accountable for. But we won't really be talking about reports today. I see. Thanks, Robin. You placing that link in the chat to where the pop-up PD resources are. And once again, LACOFA has provided translation of those pop-up PD resources for the last several years en français, and you can also access them there as well. And just before I turn things over to Robin, I will briefly mention our Employment Ontario Partners Gateway site. And when I say our, I mean for all people working within Employment Ontario in the province and within our ministry. You'll notice at the top left, if you happen to log into this site, that it says Ministry of Colleges and Universities. They've never changed it to our ministry, Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development. However, the government is doing an update on this website. So I'm assuming they're going to replace the ministry logo there when they update it. This is a site that's important to know, especially if you're a program coordinator or manager, because this is where the ministry will post important announcements that are of relevance to all Employment Ontario programs, but also specifically to LBS, to employment services, to apprenticeship. So at least once a week, someone in your organization should be checking the new postings link here on the left to see if there's any new memos from the ministry that we need to be aware of. Another useful piece of this site is under the tools menu and the submenu of forms. So you know that we have to obviously use the LBS participant registration form, and we all have to use the LBS exit and follow-up form. So currently right now, underneath forms here is where the ministry posts the most recent version of those forms. The most recent ones have been there for some time now. They haven't made any updates lately, but every once in a while they will update the forms. One or both. I believe the exit form has stayed the same for a long, long time now, but sometimes they make small changes on the participant reg form. And sometimes they will send an announcement saying we have updated the participant registration form. Please access the most current one. Sometimes the ministry doesn't tell us that. And sometimes an ETC will tell you that specifically. Sometimes they won't. ETC being the employment and training consultant from the ministry who's attached to your organization for monitoring purposes. If someone discovers that a new version has been posted, we usually get the word out pretty quickly through our networks, and so that people know that there's been a change to one of the forms, if the ministry doesn't tell us that. But again, it hasn't changed for a little while, probably at least 2 years. Last thing I'll just say about forms is that if you do click on that forms link on the Employment Ontario Partners Gateway site, you'll see a very long list of forms. And generally they are in alphabetical order by program. So the 2 forms that I just mentioned that we use in LBS, you can see them here in alphabetical order, but you do have to look down the list to find the LBS forms. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be using some portions of the user guide just to help guide some of our discussion today. If you do choose to look at that guide, what you will see is that we're focusing on the sections entitled Registering and Creating a Service Plan, adding sub-goals and plan items, the section on adding, modifying, and deleting or canceling sub-goals, and then finally closing the service plan. So at this point, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Oh, wait a second, I'm not up to date yet. Yes, good point, Robin. We always want to try to download any of the forms directly from EOPG so that you're working with the very most current version. And yes, Elisha pointed out that the form was changed, 2023, that sounds about right, yeah. Because they did update a couple of things on it at the time. So now I'm going to turn things over to Robin, and she's going to walk through some of the actual CAMS pieces that we're here to talk about today. So Robin, over to you, and I'll be controlling the slides. So Robin's going to tell me when she wants me to advance them if I don't figure it out.
Okay, thank you very much, Barb. Just before I get started, somebody is having trouble accessing the link. It's basically, if you just Google EOPG or Employment Ontario Partners Gateway, you should find the link for that site. If you're working in literacy and basic skills or any Ontario program, you should probably have that bookmarked and know where that is at all times. And I just wanted to reiterate, it might seem a little onerous to go to the site to download the form, but if you make that a habit or a practice, you never have to worry about whether or not you're working with the most current version of the form. We encourage people to do that with all of the documentation that you find on the Employment Ontario Partners Gateway, because we really typically don't know when they make a change to something. The next section or couple of sections that I'm going to walk you through include a series of, I think, 21 tips. And before we dive into this, I want to just make it clear that this isn't a comprehensive training for CAMS. What we're trying to do is just highlight some of the important tips that, excuse me, we've learned over the last several years working with this system. Both Barb and I have been around long enough that we were here, excuse me, when CAMS was introduced. I just need to take a drink.
And it was introduced in 2011-12. So we've been using it for, gosh, 13 years now. And it's been many different updates and iterations in that time.
Okay, thanks, Barb.
Okay.
This happened, sorry, I'm having a little bit of a coughing spell. The last time Barb and I did a webinar, this happened to her.
Yeah.
So,
if you need me to jump in, Robin, just say so if you need a break for a minute.
thank you. So I guess I just want to start by talking about the fact that the data that we put into CAMS is really tied to our accountability with the ministry. So when it comes to the data entry and file management, which we're going to talk about today, I would encourage you to use the resources that we've shared with you. Go to them, especially if you're new and haven't had a lot of training around this. Use those resources. But more importantly, I think it's really helpful to find somebody who can be a mentor to you. Somebody who has worked in CAMS and knows the system can be a really invaluable resource. If you don't know somebody like that, reach out to your provincial support organization or a regional network and ask them if they can connect you with somebody who has a lot of experience working in this system. And trust me, this is a helping field. They'll find you someone that will support you. Don't be afraid to ask. Make sure you ask questions if you're not sure. It's a pretty important database. You're collecting important information. So you want to make sure that you're comfortable doing it, but also that you're being careful and very accurate when you're working in the system. Okay, go ahead. Next. I'll just say next, Barb. So we're going to walk through a whole bunch of tips now. And the first tip, and probably one of the most important tips, is save, save, save. When you're in the system, save whatever you are doing often. You will get logged out automatically after about 15 minutes of complete inaction. But even while you're working in the system, save, save, save. Make it a habit. Every time I enter 1 or 2 pieces of data, I save again. I have experienced many times being in the system and having something happen, having a glitch happen, having it shut down. Not so much anymore, more in the early days, but it still can happen. And if you haven't saved what you've most recently been working on, you will lose it. So saving is very important. And the other thing that you need to remember is that you are working in a database, you are collecting personal information, and it's really important to make sure that you're logging out when you're finished, or even if you're leaving your computer unattended for a minute or 2. If you're going to walk away from your desk, you should probably close the system, log back out of the system. Next. Okay, tip number 2, client record. Before you put somebody into the system, it's really important to make sure that they're not already there. This will save you a lot of grief, because if you make sure they're not in the system, you won't create a duplicate file. One of the things with CAMS is that there aren't a lot of things that you can necessarily delete, and one of them is when you put somebody in. So you can't delete them back out of the system. Once you put them in the system, you actually have to go through the ministry to make that happen.
Robin, I'm going to interject. Jessica has a question. She has raised her hand.
Okay, sure.
Stacy can unmute you, Jessica, if you're not able to unmute. Or you can type your question into the chat, but if it's easier to just speak, that's fine too. Oh, you didn't mean to hit it. Okay, no problem. We'll just disregard that one.
Thanks,
Okay.
Barb. So now that we collect social insurance numbers, the one benefit of it, there aren't very many from most providers' perspectives, but the one benefit of it actually is in CAMS, because you can use the social insurance number in the reference number field to search for a record that already exists. And because you have to put a social insurance number in now, it's going to likely capture somebody who's already in the system. If you can't find anything, however, if you search by social insurance number and you still can't find them, still go to the next step of entering their last name, their first name, and their date of birth to make sure that they aren't in the system. If there is no duplicate in the system, then go ahead and register the person to create a new record for them. So this honestly, it's a bit annoying, just speaking candidly, because I do it all the time. But again, if you make sure that you're not duplicating the record, you're going to save yourself a lot of trouble afterwards. So just a note too, when we're talking about learners and clients, when you first put them in the system, you're creating kind of a background client. We don't refer to them as learners until they actually have a service plan in place. So that's where there's a distinction between a client and a learner. They become a learner when they have a service plan in literacy and basic skills, but they have a client record first that you put that service plan on. So, oh, back one slide. So if you do locate a duplicate or existing client record, you can then proceed with that record. But the first thing you need to do is check and make sure that the person information matches what's on your PRF or participant registration form. So if somebody is already in the system and has accessed service somewhere else, it could have been a long time ago. It might have only been a short time ago, but some of their information might be different from when it was collected previously to what you collected on your participant registration form. So you need to update that information. If something doesn't match, like that's important, like country of birth or the birth date, you should really touch base with the client to ensure that the information you have on your participant registration form is in fact the correct information. I'm just going to scan the chat here because there's some discussion. So a couple of, I only ever use last name and birth date because often first names can be spelled differently. And that's a good point, Anita. I often will use last name and birth date and initial. So I'll use different iterations to try to make sure. It's not as much of an issue anymore now that we are using social insurance numbers, but it used to be a big issue. You would have often clients in the system with different names, sometimes multiple records for the same client when you went to enter them. Okay, next, there's a comment. I have a question regarding a recent scenario from a colleague who is unable to attend today. That's from Christine Brandt. Did you want to ask that question, Christine? And if so, yeah, your hand is up. So maybe we can give you a mic so that you can ask that question.
You should be good to talk
Thanks,
now.
Robin. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
We can.
Okay, thank you. I have a quick question of an issue that my colleague ran into the other day. She was in CAMS trying to create a new profile for a learner. She entered in the SIN number. It came up with a result. However, the SIN number that the learner profile that showed up was not matching the name of the learner that she was trying to register. She had mentioned that she confirmed the SIN number with the student and also confirmed the name as it was issued on their photo ID, and confirmed that they did not go by an alternative name. And she was wondering, what should she do in this case?
I would probably contact the ministry in this case.
Okay, thank you, Robin.
Barb, do you agree?
yes, we definitely would do that in ace distance. That's happened to us a couple of times. So that's the best thing to do. And I think you've also answered Anita's question at the same time in the chat, because I believe that was her question as well.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Anita, for confirming.
And there's one more question about a SIN being updated. For example, somebody who has a 900 series SIN who then gets a permanent SIN number.
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that because I've never experienced that. And I'm not sure if you can update a SIN number from that end because I've never tried to do it. Or delete it and add a new one. I don't know if you can do that or not.
I think that you can't, Robin. I don't think you can, because we've also had that experience as well. I'm going out on a limb here and saying that in the background, when it's the federal government who uses the SIN numbers to capture general data, I would think that, say, for example, the 900 series SIN would be connected to their new SIN when they get a new one, I would think. So we have just left, our practice has just been to leave the 900 series SIN in there.
Yep.
Because it is still valid and likely still attached to that person. But it does come up occasionally though.
Yeah. So I'm going to say, if we can't, so if I was faced with this situation and I can't answer that question definitively myself, I would always contact my ETC, because I've been doing this for a long time. So if I'm not sure, if I have any questions whatsoever around that type of information and what to do with it, I would always contact the ETC, which I apologize. I've been using that acronym, Employment and Training Consultant. And yeah, there's just some more comments in there about that. And Jessica, when you have to add a social insurance number in for somebody, it does go in that alternate ID, that section. Sometimes, occasionally, you might have a situation where you have somebody who's in the system already, and they don't actually have a social insurance number entered because their record predates that requirement, and their file maybe never has been closed by the other agency. So that can actually happen, and has happened to me a few times, where I have had to add the SIN number in because you can't add it in without, you can't close the file anymore without adding it in.
Robin, and if you don't mind, I'm just going to add one little point to that, because we're just chatting in the chat a bit about contacting the ETC. So Sarah Reeser, you would be able to do that through Sarah Latangio. We would caution you though that the ETCs are not there as a help desk to send all of your CAMS inquiries to. They don't use CAMS the same way that we do. So they generally would not be able to answer your questions. That's why we do training like this.
Yep.
And produce the resources, both the English and French ones you saw before, that will hopefully help you. And as Robin mentioned, why having a mentor or just a more experienced go-to person within your organization or another organization is a great thing. I don't know, Tiffany. I don't think that's really a forum question because it's more of a policy piece in terms of the SIN issues. I would think it would be better to go directly to your ETC on questions regarding the SIN.
Yeah, it's very specific what you would go to an ETC for. And if it's an issue with social insurance number and it isn't solvable, or you know, readily solvable, that is the type of issue that you might escalate. However, you would do that depending on the type of organization you're in, either through your manager or directly to the employment and training consultant. But the everyday, day-to-day issues you might encounter or questions you have, definitely they're not in a position to answer those. Okay, I think we can go on. So tip number 4 is about the self-identification information. Again, this is an area that there's a lot of discussion that goes on about this particular piece. Self-identification is part of what is called the tombstone data of the person homepage. So when you set up the original Employment Ontario case, whoever did that, it might not be you if they're already in the system, would have captured this information at that point in time. You're going to want to see whether or not what's in there matches what you have on your registration form, especially if it's already in there. It's important to make sure that this information is as accurate as possible, but also you have to respect the fact that this is client self-identification information. If they do self-identify differently than they did initially after the fact, you should probably update this. What we do as practice in my agency, we do have paper-based though, is we have them initial and update, or if you're if you're working digitally, I would have some type of a notation or case note that they change the self-identification of one of these factors. What's important to remember is that some of the information in client self-identification does actually tie to performance measures, and that's why it's important to make sure that it's accurate and up to date. Okay, there are two hands up.
I was just going to say that. So Swati, I'm going to unmute you. And if you do still have a question, Swati, would you like to go ahead and ask it? You can you can actually just click the unmute button yourself because we've given you a voice now. Okay. I'm going to switch over here for a second to Leanna. Leanna, you can go ahead if you did want to ask a question. You can unmute yourself, Leanna. Okay, I'm not sure if Swati or Leanna does want to speak. You can certainly type into the chat as well, and we'll monitor that as we have been. Christine has a question in the chat as well. What if they have identified as something with another agency and still have an active case with them? I'll let you address that one, Robin.
Okay, so this is a tricky one, Christine, and it's something that happens a lot. And it all depends on the situation. So in some cases, it can be addressed if two agencies are co-located and a discussion can take place. What I tend to do, if I know that they have a active case somewhere else and some of this information differs, is, I mean, the one thing you could do is clarify it with the client. The other thing sometimes I will do is I will actually make a note on the PRF. I use sticky notes, and I will identify that the information, the tombstone data differs from what we collected, and that I didn't change it because of that. So it's a kind of a gray area. And that's the best I'm going to answer that. It's not something that anybody ever probably anticipated when they set up this system. Okay. I tend to add information rather than remove. Yeah, that's true. Folks may or may not be comfortable disclosing a disability. Absolutely true. With respect to this, again, there's different ways to address this whole self-identification piece. And I'm not going to get into too much detail on it. But it's just, you need to be aware of it. You need to be aware of the fact that it does feed into performance management. You should ensure that it does, to the best of your ability, match what you collected, and put measures in place if there are discrepancies, such as addressing it with the client, if you're able to, addressing it with the other agency, or making notes of it, so that if your file is audited, you have that backup in your file. Yep. Okay, I'm going to continue on, or we will never get finished today. So next slide.
Okay.
Tip 4, the address. So this particular feature can be glitchy at times. It seems to be glitchy, then not glitchy. What you should do is, if you can't find a postal code, use Canada's postal code finder tool to try to figure out what it is. This just kind of gives you a snapshot of where you modify the address. So in your contact information in addresses, this is where you can modify or change an address, especially if their address changes or it differs from what's in the system and the tombstone data. I have had several instances recently where developments are so new that they don't have an existing postal code in the postal code tool yet. In very extreme cases, we have used the address of the agency if we had to. But again, this is one that you can't really fix on your own if you can escalate this if there's an issue with postal code. So in extreme cases where you can't, you have the right postal code, but you can't populate it, you can escalate this one. Or report it to your ETC, and as kind of a backup in the meantime, use your agency address to be able to set up an address. Okay, next. Education and employment information. So one of the things that we collect in literacy and put into CAMS is that education background information. Often learners can't recall the exact dates or the details, so you try to get them to give you their best guess and estimate when they started and finished things. As kind of a tip, if they can't remember the exact date in which they started, for example, a program or finished a program, but they remember the month, use the first of the month as a default. So that's just a tip to try to use. Employment information, we are highly encouraged to collect this information. Some agencies do it, some agencies don't do it. Many only enter this information if the learner has identified that their goal is employment. But if you are entering this information, one change that they made a few years ago is that you can search for the codes, the NOC and the NAIC within the database itself. Try to use the closest one that you can find if you can't find an exact match. And a tip is to actually create a cheat sheet of common ones if you do have common ones in your area that seem to crop up.
Robin, Alicia just asked, is there still the ability to override the postal code? I can't remember.
I don't know that you can override it anymore, Alicia.
No.
I haven't had it happen in a while. I've actually had it happen where I've put in a postal code and I've had to put it in 2 or 3 times and then it's finally caught. So Christine said it, she was able to about 6 months ago.
So probably that's still the case.
Yeah, probably the case. I haven't had it happen recently. So, okay. Alrighty, moving right along. Tip number 7 is creating a new service plan. So one of the things you need to do is obviously you have to create a new service plan on the EO homepage, the Employment Ontario homepage. And the fields that you're completing are the program, which is obviously going to be literacy and basic skills, if that's the type of agency you are. You're going to identify a referred in, and that is going to be located in the client summary portion of your participant registration form. The owner, you're going to identify the owner unless it defaults to who you are already. It depends on how many users you have in your system and what their roles are. And your service delivery site, you'll need to select unless you only have one site, and then it's going to default to the site that you're at. Self-service initiated. So if you receive a referral through the Employment Ontario self-service application, which typically what happens is they fill it out online and you are notified through an email that you have an application. You have to log into the system to get that information. This is when you would identify self-service initiated because they've gone through the self-service portal. If they haven't, then you wouldn't select that. And last but not least is the template. And the template is actually the goal path. So you're going to pick one of 5 goal paths. When you save the service plan, it's going to have an open status in the system. Later in the process, you have to take steps to ensure that it's approved. And then last, it becomes active. And you have to do certain things to make it go from open to approved to active. It's important that all of your service plans are active or activated, because only your active service plans count towards the ministry's performance measures. And Barb just noted that the new name for Employment Ontario Self-Service is the Request a Service Provider, or RASP, because the ministry loves to change things, and also they love to come up with great new acronyms. Okay. So next slide. So your client summary is really an important piece that is easy to miss. And you really want to make sure that all the applicable fields from the client summary on your participant registration form are entered into CAMS, because some of them do feed into performance management. Your entry assessment tool is the type of assessment used. Your estimated learner weekly time commitment. The date of assessment is the date they completed your program's intake assessment. And these are just some notes on here. This is a big section that you want to complete and put all this data in, but these are just some notes. If the labor force attachment is employed full-time, then you're going to put time out of work as NA. If you miss certain things as you're entering data into CAMS in this section that are required, or throughout the process when you're entering client data, if it's a required field, it's going to tell you, it's going to stop you before you can save it and ask you to fill that information in. Okay, so Lisa just made a comment. I am finding the language section more challenging because language spoken at last workplace doesn't have an other option. Luckily, although weirdly, it's not a mandatory field, right? So that is a lucky. And there are certain things that change over time, and that's probably a good example of something that's changed over time. Where we have a lot of newcomers coming into LBS programs right now. So the language at their last workplace could be an other, not something that's identified in the list. Okay. Tip number 9, learner gains. So learner gains is an assessment approach that the ministry's never actually put into place. You should never enter anything under learner gains. So that we've just as a tip, you should know this. It was part of the draft performance management system. There's a placeholder in here, but we don't enter learner gains and hopefully never will. So don't put anything in those fields. Okay. Tip number 10, referral in. It's important to record a referral in source because most referrals count towards the performance management or the performance measure of service coordination. There are 3 referral in sources that don't actually count, but you should still record them. And those are EO, literacy, and basic skills service provider. So when LBS providers are referring to other LBS providers, it doesn't count, but you should still record it. And informal word of mouth or media referral. So when somebody says, hey, this is a great program, you should go to it. That's an example of informal word of mouth, or if they've seen an ad or something. So those don't count, or no response doesn't count. But you should always record all your referral in data, because it gives a body of data that can be looked at historically. So at some point, maybe there'll be a change and informal word of mouth might count. That would be fantastic, because to me, that's one of the most important types of referral. But right now it doesn't. Okay, I'm just checking. Okay, Barb, you're monitoring, so
Yeah.
I'll let you answer when you can in the chat. Tip 11, adding sub-goals and plan items. So this is where you add milestones, learning activities, referrals, and training supports. So this is essentially your service plan for the learner. The expected start date and expected end date for each plan item will default to the current date, but you can adjust that. A custom basic plan item is used when a plan item isn't on the list. So different programs use this in different ways. So you should know internally how you're using this, this section. What's really important is that all dates on your hard copy documentation, or if you're using digital files as well, must match what is in the system. Can't stress that enough. If you have a file audit, they are going to look at that, and they are starting to do file audits again, is my understanding. They've started to do them in the last fiscal and current fiscal year. The status of plan items. So when a plan item is first created, it says not started. When you put in an actual start date, it's going to go to in progress. So you have to be just really aware when you're adding sub-goals and plan items that you actually start them, or they won't be in progress. Okay, approval of the service plan. So once you've put in your initial sub-goals and plan items, because as we know, often service plans, you add to them over time, but you usually have an initial plan with the learner. You have to submit that plan for approval. So really what this is an internal system check to make sure all the elements of the service plan are in there. The dates on the plan items should be on or after the service plan start date. So this is, again, it's more of an internal check, and you just click yes. And then that will allow you to move on to the next step with that service plan. Next, okay. So the plan summary, this is really important, because the plan summary is what moves your service plan from approved to active. The date of the plan summary is the date the learner accepts or agrees to the plan that you've made. For example, the date they sign it. So if you're working on a hard copy, they're actually signing that and dating that. That should match what you have in the system. Once you put the plan summary in, you put that date in, and you accept it, the service plan, as I said, changes from approved to active. This is an important step because service plans have to be active to count towards your performance measures. Your closed service plans in the current fiscal year also count. Okay, so check your active service plans. Click on View My Cases from your dashboard and make sure that the status of all your service plans is active. I do this every couple of weeks, and the reason I do it is because every once in a while when I'm doing data entry, I get interrupted. And sometimes when I get interrupted, I forget to take the last step, which is the step we just talked about. So I have a plan, it has actually been approved, but it isn't active yet, which means it's just sitting there. It's not doing anything. It's not going to feed into your report 64. Okay. Next. Multiple service plans. So one thing that's, I think it's great for learners is that they can have an active service plan with more than one LBS program, or they can have an active service plan with LBS and another Employment Ontario service provider, such as Employment Services. So if somebody is, for example, at an in-class or in-person literacy and basic skills program, and they are also accessing literacy and basic skills through eChannel, complementary something else, that the fully online program, they can have both of those service plans open at the same time. That's one example. Sometimes a learner might have an active service plan at 2 face-to-face agencies because they're actually accessing different things at those agencies. However, keep in mind that every separate service plan a learner has will generate a 3, 6, and 12-month follow-up at exit. So they could have multiple agencies calling to do follow-ups throughout the year if they've had more than one service plan.
Robin, Karina has asked the question, when do you use the reopen when creating a service plan?
When do you use the reopen?
Reopen.
I don't really understand that question.
Nor do I.
I'm not really sure what you're referring to, Karina. Sorry. If you could maybe type some more context in, I'm going to continue on and then I'll come back to that. This is just a little tip chart, desk mate or desk thing that you can use that just makes sure that you don't miss a step and that you end up with an active service plan. And it's the A through G steps. So generate the new service plan for the client from the template, create that client summary. So that client summary piece is really important because you can go through all the steps and not create it. But it does have data that feeds into performance management. So that's a big part of this. You add your sub goals, which are your milestones, your learning activities, and your plan items. So those things together. You have your sub goals and then your plan items related to your sub goals. You need to then submit that plan for approval. So that's that internal system check. Then you want to create that plan summary, and that's where the learner has agreed to the plan, and you put that date in and create that plan summary and record acceptance of the plan summary. So once you're at step G, then what you're going to have is an active service plan in the system. Okay, next. So we're going to talk a little bit about tips for maintaining and updating a service plan now. So maintaining a service plan in CAMS means that you're entering that data regularly as the learner works through different elements. So you're entering or updating the learning activities they're doing, the milestones that they've completed, the referrals that happen, and any training supports that you're actually administering to them. And these things can happen throughout the cycle of life of a service plan. So they don't necessarily always happen at the beginning and the end. It's something that happens as the learner's in your program. And as things happen, you should really make sure that you are updating those service plans on a regular basis. So this just gives you the inactive cases report and the case activity report are 2 places that you can go for a little extra information. And I'm not going to get into that. We've done webinars just on the reports that you can look at that are on the pop-up PD in previous years that will give you more insight into those reports that you can access and how you can use those to make sure that you're staying up to date.
So Karina just clarified her question, Robin, in the chat. When you're on a person's EO homepage, one of the action options is reopen.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that. I I've never seen that. I'm not even sure where it is on there. I've never done it. So I'm going to be quite frank. I'm not really sure when you would reopen an Employment Ontario case, because that stays open, that the kind of the bucket case stays open unless a person actually is deceased, and then you can add different service plans from different services. Barb, are you familiar or aware?
I am not familiar with that either, Robin.
Okay.
So Karina, sorry, we can't give you any more information on that one today.
No. I will look into it though.
Yeah, we will.
Because I'm still not 100%. I need to look at the system
Mhm.
to see what you're referring to.
Me too.
Okay. Okay, deleting plan items. So the tip here is you can delete a plan item, but you have to delete from the bottom up. So you have to delete the sub goal first, and then you have to delete up. It's a little tricky to do, but in the end, you can delete the whole plan item. You just have to start at the sub goal. So you can do it. If you make an error, you can actually delete it. But if it actually has a start date in it, you do have to delete that start date out first. Okay. Canceling plan items. So again, you can cancel a plan item. I just wanna, you might need to cancel something if, for example, a learner leaves before completing it or changes their goals and it's no longer a relevant milestone. This is just kind of gives you the steps. Remove the start date, enter canceled, click save. And you will see the status will have a canceled outcome. What you should do is make sure you also update the paper-based learner plan to make sure that it reflects or matches what's in the system if you do take this step with an item in the service plan. So always, that's just a good tip in general. Always make sure whatever you do in the system matches what you have on paper. If there's something strange or glitchy that's hard to capture it in a case note and explain if there's something a little different. That's how we kind of deal with that, so that if a file is ever audited, there's always backup or an explanation. Okay. Moving on to tips for closing a service plan. So the LBS exit and follow-up form is completed when they leave, and it gives you the information you need to close their service plan in CAMS. Just a few tips related to that. So next slide. Checking information. Make sure, again, everything matches. If anything has been updated since they joined your program, also update that as well. Addresses, phone, email, education, employment. Close everything. Make sure everything on your service plan is closed. If you haven't closed or finalized a sub goal or a goal, you won't be able to close the file. It will give you a message, but just go through and check. I usually check every element, every page before I close a file. And that sounds onerous, but again, putting that time in up front before you close a file can save you a lot of trouble afterwards. Set your sub-goal outcomes to attained, not attained, or canceled, depending on what happened. And just ensure that you have everything filled out and matching before you close the file. Okay. Closure checklist. This is something that a lot of agencies do. We do this in our program. It's just a checklist to make sure that everything is in the hard copy file, or if you're using a digital online files, is there and complete before you close. So this is something that we do. I go through this checklist and make sure everything's there, everything matches before I go through the process of closing a file. I actually have this form set up in our agency to do mid-year checks as well. So if somebody's here for a longer duration, we will pull files mid-year just to, not for closing, but just to make sure everything that should be there up to that point is there. So this is just one example, and you can customize something like this for your own program. It's especially useful if you have multiple people working on files.
Robin, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, Lori was just asking, when would you use canceling
Yeah.
a plan item?
Yeah, so you would cancel an item if somebody actually changed their goal and you had to cancel that milestone for that reason, would be an example. Very rarely do I cancel a milestone either. It would be where they didn't complete it, but they hadn't attempted it. So not attained would indicate that they tried to do it, but they didn't attain it, or they weren't successful. Whereas canceled is you would cancel it for other reasons. They might leave, they might, and not ever try to do it. They might change their goal, and that milestone might no longer be relevant. Okay. Closure reasons and exit outcomes. Just make sure that all staff are on the same page and using the same processes when you're closing files. Make sure everybody understands reasons for closure and the outcomes at exit that are found on your exit and follow-up forms. And make sure that everybody in your program is selecting the reasons and outcomes consistently. So this is internal. Make sure that all staff are on board and are all doing the same thing. And remember, once a service plan is closed in CAMS, it can't be reopened. The only thing you can change are the closure details. The closure reason can't be changed once the service plan has been closed with a reason of opened in error. So you can change closure details except for closure reason if it has been closed as opened in error. So again, that's why we put so much stress on that closing portion of the file. You want to make sure that you are 100% that you have all the information and that it's all correct before you close your service plan. And I'm going to turn it back over to Barb for the last part of the presentation. And I apologize, Barb, we are going to run out of time, but we had a lot of great questions today.
Yeah, absolutely. Not to worry, there's a lot of to get through today. Even if we don't get through the last couple of slides, you can view them in the recording, but there isn't much left at this point. Christine asked, why does CAMS ask for survey responses when a service plan is closed as opened in error? Maybe Robin can type something into the chat if you have an answer for that one, Robin, while I finish up here.
Yep.
So although we're not going to be talking about it today, I'm sure you're aware in your organization that the ministry monitors and uses the data that we put in CAMS to help assess how well we are performing toward a set of performance measures that they identify. Your program manager will be very familiar with those performance measures, but what we want to stress today is just that the more accurate and up-to-date your data is in CAMS, the better your program is going to do on that performance side that the ministry kind of holds us to and is really important for our accountability to the ministry. Robin just alluded to this a minute ago. It's great if, say, once every couple of months, you can pull out a couple of files from your own organization and somehow with, your staff or with one other person, go through an audit and make sure that what you have in the file does actually match what's in CAMS, and that the paperwork is there, it's accurate, it's complete. Because in fact, this is exactly what ministry does. If they come and do a file audit, they will ask you for a selection of files and they will go through them pretty much with a fine-tooth comb and look for exact consistency between what's in the file and what's in CAMS. And that, that includes the training support information and so on. So if you have the ability to do, pull a couple of files, as I said, every couple of months or every 6 months to do that comparison for yourself, then you're likely to catch anything major that maybe needs improving in the processes you're using either in CAMS or in your paper files. And then tip number 23, close files promptly. It's really important not to let files sit after the learner has exited when you know they're not coming back for any length of time. Because as Robin has mentioned a couple of times, closed files are largely what counts towards our performance measures and the data the ministry uses to monitor us. So the more promptly you close your files, the more data will actually feed into those good measures, and the better you will be appearing in terms of making those performance measures. And then last but not least, we only have a few seconds to chat about the monthly information and referral data. There is a place where aggregate data is entered into CAMS in terms of information referral inquiries that you get. These would refer to clients, people who you have perhaps met with, done an information session for, that are not actually registering with you. So you're not opening a plan for them. It's just a very broad way to record the kind of general inquiries and information sessions that you do. The ministry doesn't monitor this, but they do expect it to be entered into CAMS. If you're on the service homepage in CAMS and you're under the aggregate data tab, you will see what appears here on the screenshot with information sessions, participation, and wait lists. We don't have time to go into that in much depth, but very briefly, you do want to have a process in place to collect that data in your organization. Not everybody does information sessions, and that's fine. But if you do hold information sessions, there is a way to record that. There's a way to record the number of people that you refer to another agency. Again, those aren't people that are coming to your program as well. Those are people who in your initial triage and perhaps intake questioning with them, you determine that they're not a fit for your organization, and so you're referring them somewhere else. And then, of course, if you do have a wait list, there's a place to record that as well. So we are at 3:29, and as Robin said, we're very happy that we had lots of questions. Super glad that so many people were able to log in today. Please do take a minute and do the quick, very, very quick survey at the end when you log out. It won't take you any time at all. So briefly, again, thank you for coming. Robin, any closing tips or closing comments?
Sorry, I turned my mic off.
That's okay.
No, I'm good. And we hope we answered lots of your questions. Again, it wasn't meant to be a comprehensive, just some tips and tricks. And we hopefully you got something out of it. And again, we're always open to questions. So.
Thanks, everybody. And I think the recording is going to stop now.